In a Bloomberg poll, 46% said the process had become too negative. Only a third said it had struck the right balance. Both Karl Rove and Haley Barbour have voiced concerns in the last week about how long the contest is going on. Haley Barbour was far more colorful when he said, "I don't think anybody in their right mind thinks that the way the primaries have played out has been good for Republican chances." Romney's negatives have risen sharply, and while his campaign says that they're similar to what Bill Clinton's were at this point in the primary cycle, Bill Clinton was dealing with Gennifer Flowers. In the new ABC Post poll, 42% had a negative view of Romney, up from 34% in January. Santorum was also upside down with a 40% unfavorable rating. His unfavorable rating in January was 29%. In the handout we prepared for you, we look at the 16 states for which we have entrance and exit poll data. And here I especially want to thank Andrew Rugg and Jennifer Marsko, who worked to compile this material. The groove that each candidate is in quickly becomes apparent by looking at the results displayed in the handout. This morning we're going to take a very quick look at the primaries and caucuses, and then we're going to start looking ahead. But first I'd like to say a few words about the polls on health care and on President Obama. Many years ago, and it was so long ago that I can't find any of the polls in the data archives that I use, I was struck by strong public opposition to motorcycle helmet laws. There was also strong public opposition to seatbelt laws initially. People just don't want the federal government to tell them what to do. In every poll we have seen, opposition to the individual mandate is strong. People think that the Supreme Court should rule it unconstitutional. But that said, the verdict on the law itself is far more complicated. Opinion on the law is split. We've had 3 polls thus far in March. In the ABC News Washington Post poll released yesterday, 41% said they supported the bill, 52% opposed it. In the March Pew poll, the numbers were reversed, 47% in favor, 45% opposed. Kaiser's March poll had it at 41-40. President Obama's marks on handling health care are more negative than positive in every recent poll. But in virtually every poll, people prefer the Democratic Party and the Democrats in Congress to the Republican Party or the Republicans in Congress to handle the issue. People aren't sure that they're going to be better off. They think the uninsured will be better off, and they're equally divided about whether the country will be better off under Obamacare. Turning very quickly to President Obama, several major pollsters have painted very different pictures about where the president is at this point, with one putting the president's approval rating at a low of 41% and several others having him hugging that magic 50% number. Many things can affect polls when you have a generally inattentive public as we do. One poll was taken just before the jobs report came out, another immediately after. Or the results could just be statistical noise at a time when the pollsters have very high non-response rates. We'll see a great deal of variation until we get closer to the election. Now let's turn to our 3 panelists and ask them to begin by telling us what their most important takeaway has been from the Republican races to date. In his column on Sunday, Dan Balz said that in 2008, the Obama campaign officials sat down after Super Tuesday, which was February 5th in 2008, and predicted with great accuracy the results of each contest based on the demographic patterns that emerged very early in the Obama-Clinton race. In 2012, we've also seen very clear and consistent demographic patterns in candidate support. Henry, why don't you begin by talking about the grooves the candidates are in, and 3 minutes maximum.
Thanks, Carlin. The candidates have a very clear division in their support. Romney does better among educated and wealthy voters. He does poorly among less educated and more religious voters. What I'd like to do to tail that is just talk about the split between rural and urban voters. Michael, I believe, is going to go into more detail about the appeal of Romney to the urban and suburban voters. But if you take a look at the map, the thing that stands out is islands of Romney support amidst seas of non-Romney support. And that's true whether he wins a primary or loses a primary. He's doing terribly among rural voters and small-town voters. In virtually every state, again, whether he wins or loses, he wins the biggest city in the state He wins the surrounding suburbs most of the time, although he didn't do it in Alabama, but he loses the rural areas big. And one way to think about that is think about sports, which is that in every state with a contested primary that has a major league baseball team, Romney will carry the county that has that team. If if there are other franchises in the state that are lower value than Major League, like a AA team, he won't carry that generally. And if he does, it's because they're in the orbit, the media market of the Major League team. He also carries state capitals. He has not lost a state capital in a contested primary yet. Again, where do you find educated voters? Where do you find wealthy voters? You find them in teams that are areas that are wealthy enough to support major league sports franchises, and you find them in areas that attract educated people, which it tends to be state capitals and universities. But in rural areas, he's getting destroyed. He lost in Iowa, Lyon County, by 54%. In every state, he loses the rural areas by 10 to 20 points on average. In virtually every state, there's one outlier where he loses a county by 30% or more. And I think some of this is an appeal of Santorum, but it's also a pattern that's appeared when Gingrich was his main challenger in Florida and in South Carolina and in his home state of Georgia. There, the same pattern arises. It's just a different person who's on top. And it's worth recalling how the Santorum surge started. It started 2 weeks before the Iowa caucus, when suddenly Gingrich was being imploded by negative ads from the Romney campaign, and conservative leaders, particularly religious ones, cast about for somebody who wasn't Romney. And they found Rick Santorum, the only candidate at that time undamaged by Romney attacks. There's a strong antipathy towards Mitt Romney among rural Republicans in the Midwest and in the South. Less so outside of those areas, but even there, outside in the rural West, you'll see Santorum running strongest in eastern Washington, which is rural, and weakest in urban Washington. The Romney campaign should take note of this, because if they're going to beat Barack Obama, it's one thing to be able to appeal to the suburban swing voter that went for Obama in 2008 and Bush in 2004, but they'll make those votes count towards victory if he can continue the huge margins that Republican voters, candidates have come to rely on in the rural areas. And if he has a problem with rural swing voters, then he's going to have a problem putting together a majority.
Henry, yesterday the demographer Joel Kotkin said that the Republicans have a fatal attraction to rural America. He made the point that rural America constitutes only 16% of the country, down from 72% a century ago. Is it a fatal attraction?
The country's moving towards being more suburban. Ultimately, the Republican Party has to win a majority in the suburbs. It needs to win a majority in the suburbs outside of its comfort zone in the South. If you take a look at the map from 1988, when George Herbert Walker Bush got 53%, and the map that John McCain rolled up when he got 46% against Barack Obama, the thing that stands out is the lack of support in the suburbs, that places in the North and the West that went for Bush in 88 went for Obama uniformly in 2008. The Republican Party can't be a majority without becoming a majority party in the suburbs. But on the other hand, a party that supports lower government throughout the last 60 years has almost always drawn more support in rural areas than urban areas. You can almost see it in poll after poll that if the question is the size of government, you'll run smaller government will run strongest in the rural areas and weakest in the urban areas, and suburban areas are right in between. So they have to become a suburban party, but as long as they're running as a party that's small government, they'll do it with overwhelming rural support, and they can't jeopardize that.
Michael, what patterns have been most interesting to you in the primaries?
Well, I just want to make one point about Henry's presentation. He noted that Romney's been carrying counties that carry state capitals. There will be an acid test of this in the South Dakota primary, where Hughes County, where the site of the state capital of Pierre is. This is now the smallest state capital. I think there are 2 motels in town. You can pass through pretty quickly. So that's going to be a tough test of Mitt Romney. Well, as Henry said, what struck me about this primary season most of all is Mitt Romney's apparent appeal to affluent voters. In all the states with exit or entrance polls, he's been running 4 to 12 points ahead of his statewide average among voters over $100,000 income. In Michigan, he carried Oakland County, the most prosperous county in where he grew up, by 31,565 votes. He carried the rest of the state by 413 votes. Almost all of his margin came from the most affluent county. In Ohio, he carried Cuyahoga and Hamilton counties, the counties of Cleveland and Cincinnati, where most of the Republican primary voters tend to be on the affluent side, by 31,682 votes. That was 3 times his statewide margin. It's likely to do better in Illinois today. In Michigan, the metro Detroit counties, above average income, state income, constituted 40% of the vote. In Ohio, the counties including or just surrounding Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati accounted for 40% of the vote. In Illinois in 2008, the Cook County and the Collar counties, DuPage, Kane, Kendall, Lake, McHenry, and Will, cast 54% of the statewide vote. So that's a demographic advantage for Romney. Why does he carry this? Well, you know, Mitt Romney comes from the grassroots of America, if you count the grassroots of the fairway of the Bloomfield Hills Country Club. And he's, I think affluent voters seem to find him kind of a kindred spirit. He's articulate but politically awkward, sort of like them, self-disciplined and successful. He's able to make a sharp argument, but he's polite. He takes conservative stands on cultural issues, but in a way that reminds me of the 18th century English woman's gravestone that noted approvingly, she was religious without enthusiasm. The question I think that's interesting, will this carry over to the general election? In 2008, Barack Obama's appeal to young voters and high education voters in states like Indiana and North Carolina not only enabled him to do well in the primaries in those states, but it carried over to the general election. He carried those 2 states, which were not on the target list of any of the presidential candidates in 2000 or 2004. The appeal carried over into the general election. As Henry noted, Republicans have been losing ground in these affluent suburban counties over the last 15 years. George H.W. Bush carried the 4 suburban counties outside Philadelphia, Bucks, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, with 61% of the vote. In 2008, that's 1988. In 2008, Barack Obama carried those 4 counties with 57% of the vote, and he carried Pennsylvania by a comfortable margin. A lot of analysts have sort of said, well, these people are Democrats now. You know, they've turned left on cultural issues. They don't like Southern evangelical Protestants. They're going to be Democrats forever. Well, maybe not. I think that with the appeal, with the focus of the issue of the election, moving, despite the considerable efforts of Rick Santorum, from cultural issues to economic issues, that may or may not be the case this time. And I note also that what we've seen, the Pew Research study last year that showed that between 2008 and 2011, the percentage identifying themselves as Republican rose 9 points among Jews, 8 points among white Catholics. Those were the highest rises when you disaggregate the electorate according to religious groups. Those are groups that are heavily concentrated in the affluent suburbs of the major cities. So I think that we saw in the 2008 the old categories of red, blue, and purple states changed somewhat. I think it's possible they may change again if Mitt Romney is nominated and his appeal to affluent voters carries over into the general election.
Michael, you mentioned earlier to me this morning a new poll from Virginia. What did it show, and what does it say about your theory?
Well, Quinnipiac it tends to undercut my theory. Quinnipiac has a poll out showing Barack Obama leading Mitt Romney in Virginia 50 to 42. That's a state that went 53-46 for Obama in '08, the national average for both candidates. Quinnipiac has had samples that have been a little more favorable to Democrats than other pollsters in some states, so I see that as perhaps a little bit of an outlier. We know that Mitt Romney has taken on some baggage at this stage of the campaign. He's not running as well against Obama as the generic Republican. Republican Party leaders are out looking for the generic Republican somewhere so they could put her or him on the ballot, but they haven't found that person yet. But it says to me that this is still fighting because, you've got, say, almost 40% of your vote in Virginia, in the 30s, in what we call the Washington metro area, Northern Virginia.
Norm, what's interested you most?
I guess I'd mention a couple of things, Carlin. The first is going back to the drawn-out nature of this campaign. And one thing I should add to what you said, Haley Barbour has expressed his deep concern, but he's promised a blanket pardon to any candidate who drops out in the next 2 weeks. But obviously, it's gone on for this long and will continue to go on for two reasons. The first is I suppose you could do the campaign movie about Mitt Romney. They're just not that into you. But the second, of course, is the rules themselves. And if you go back, what's interesting to junkies about this is when the Republicans set these rules, it was long before this contest. And it's basically a part of the age-old struggle where large states like California have felt for years in both parties that they've basically been shunted aside. They used to be last, and they were pivotal. If you go back, for example, to 1972, when George McGovern and Hubert Humphrey were fighting it out, California was a key race. But in recent decades, states like California have been meaningless because it's all been over long before you got to them. And parties have tried to keep them from moving up very early in the process, while they've also tried to discourage other states from going early because they wanted to preserve the primacy of these small states like New Hampshire and Iowa. And this time it was the triumph of the big states, having this proportional representation early so that they would be relevant. Now I think you're going to see a serious rethinking, probably in both parties, about whether you want that kind of relevance. The second thing that's been striking to me is the degree to which the Republican Party has veered so sharply right in these primary contests, and so sharply right in other ways. You're now having discussions about whether there should be a minimum wage at all. Go back 10, 15 years, the idea that a candidate would have said, let's scrap the minimum wage, it would have been unthinkable. You might have said, we don't want to raise it, maybe we want to raise it by a little bit less than they want to raise it. Now it's in a very different place. And obviously that also poses a dilemma for candidates like Romney, and you can see that very clearly on the immigration issue. I think we may see this in campaign ads as we go along, but I remember the debate in Arizona where Romney basically put himself to the right of the Arizona immigration law, and there was a shot of Sheriff Arpaio in the audience nodding approvingly. To put yourself in the same camp as Sheriff Arpaio is probably not going to help much with Hispanic voters, and we now see about 18% support, half or less than what George Bush got. How you make a pivot back to the center, which is what we traditionally find in both parties, remains, I think, a huge dilemma for an ultimate Republican nominee. And for a Romney who is distrusted by conservatives and to whom he's had to continue to offer reassurance, any sign, even a modest one with a wink and a nod that he's not quite over there, will be met with outrage by people in his camp. And finally, let me say, what's perhaps most striking about this campaign is the role of money, the new world of money, which has been set not just by Citizens United, but as much as anything by the court decisions that have followed, like Speech Now, and by the Federal Election Commission. But the degree to which now candidates who would have lost all their oxygen and fallen by the wayside only need one patron to keep them going. The other side of that coin is Romney is outspending Santorum 5-1, 6-1, or you throw in the super PAC money in some states by 10-1. And it's not altering in any way the fundamental patterns that Henry and Michael have talked about. And that may be, in the end, another sign of weakness. What's also happening, partly because of these super PAC ads, and what's been, I think, a big boon to Romney up to this point, Gingrich now is savaging Santorum. These candidates who were struggling to create a dynamic where it would be the non-Mitt against Mitt have all focused on destroying each other and have still, to this point, given Romney much more of a free pass than you would normally find for a front runner. And that's been another striking element of this.
Thanks, Norm. Thank all of you. Let's now turn to Illinois and Louisiana and what you'll be watching most closely. This morning, a website called Smart Politics reported on its review of 25 Illinois presidential primaries since 1912, and in only one contest has the winner been decided by more than 10 points. I think Michael already knew the answer to this, but I wonder if anyone in the audience would like to take a guess of what presidential primary that was.
1980.
No.
No, I would have said Walter Mondale. It's 84, but that's not right.
No, that's not right. The answer is 1936.
Yeah, Mark Shields was covering that one, yeah.
He was trying to protect his Social Security.
Now, what are you watching most closely in Illinois tonight and then in Louisiana? Norm, if you could talk about the congressional race between Manzullo and Kinzinger.
Yeah, we're seeing a very interesting dynamic in many of these congressional races. In some cases, because of redistricting that's forced incumbents together. And I think one of the most interesting to this point is clearly one involving a 20-year veteran, Don Manzullo, against a Tea Party freshman who is a former Air Force officer, Adam Kinzinger. What's interesting about this in part is it's old versus young. And there's a group, Americans for Primary Accountability, now raised a substantial sum of money, and they're going in against veteran incumbents in both parties, targeting some of them. And they put in a substantial sum of money against Manzullo. Manzullo, however, who's very conservative, has the support of the Tea Party and Freedom Works, while Eric Cantor has come in and endorsed Kinzinger. So we've got some very interesting cross currents here. And given the anti-incumbent attitude out there, how that plays out is going to provide some real interest. We also have Debbie Halverson, a former office holder in Illinois, who's running against Jesse Jackson, Jr., former member of Congress. Probably will not win, but Jackson has some vulnerabilities because of a whole series of nagging ethics issues. And, of course, the example in the Ohio primary of Gene Schmidt, who was a very hard-edged person and hard-edged conservative, losing to a newcomer, has sent some reverberations, if not shockwaves, through the camp of incumbents, all of whom now are worried about a challenge. And that challenge is coming not just on the Republican side, for many of them from the right, but we're starting to see a movement to get some very liberal candidates emerging. We see that in a couple of races in Illinois as well, to try and provide a counterweight in some ways to any more centrist movement on the Democratic side. So the polarization is playing itself out even more in primaries than we've seen in a long time.
And the Campaign for Primary Accountability was also involved in the Bacchus race, which he won pretty easily, and in the Kucinich captor.
Yes, and they're they haven't had a great track record so far. They've tried to knock off about 4 or 5 senior incumbents, and so far the only success that they've had is Gene Schmidt, who has her own ethics issues as well. But they're going in against incumbents in both parties, and it's certainly, they've got enough money. We're not just talking token sums of money. I think it was over $200,000 in ads against Manzullo, that it's a different phenomenon.
Michael, does Romney break 45 in Illinois?
I think he has a real chance to break 45. The last couple of polls we've seen, one from Public Policy Polling and one from ARG, which is credibility, showed him at 45 points. I think that's possible there. I'm going to be looking at those affluent the collar counties that I mentioned before, the Cook County thing, and at the turnout by congressional district. You know, the Democrats were in charge of redistricting in Illinois, one of the few states where they were, by virtue of the Democratic candidate for governor, the incumbent after the unfortunate resignation of Rod Blagojevich. They kept that office by 1 point. They had the most aggressive partisan gerrymandering on the Democratic side in this cycle. In fact, probably the most aggressive partisan gerrymandering, redistricting. And basically what they did is they took all those Chicago districts and they sort of extend them out by little waves far out into the suburbs, connecting, so that the ward, that Dan Lipinski, who inherited the ward committeeman position in the 13th Ward and his 3rd congressional district from his father when he was a political science professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which is quite a distance from Chicago, keeps his district, and this little thread goes out into the suburbs. And the question is, have they extended it too far? Have they extended it too far for Jesse Jackson, Jr., whose district follows the movement of black homeowners into the south side suburbs of Chicago, where Jackson has been trying to build a big new airport, and so forth? What will the turnout be? I have a feeling that the Illinois Democrats, like, say, the Pennsylvania Republicans last cycle, have overextended themselves in redistricting, have gone pig, and will lose some of those districts that they hoped would be 53% districts at some point in the 10-year intercensal period, not necessarily this year with Chicago's Barack Obama on the ballot.
Henry, 2 questions for you. Newt has not been above 15% in any of the recent polls. Can he break 15%? And second, will Romney make inroads downstate? The overall polls seem to suggest that he might be able to do so.
No, Newt won't break 15%. In fact, his pattern is to drop from his pre-election polls. He tends to run 2 to 4 points behind what the last poll says. Rick Santorum tends to run 4 or 5 points ahead. If you take that pattern and assume it'll play out again in Illinois, that means Santorum, who's running at around 31%, will actually poll 34, 35, and Newt will poll around 10, 11, or 12. I think one of the things I am looking for in Illinois is the extent to which Romney makes inroads in the downstate area. I'm particularly looking at 5 areas, the smaller cities of Rockville, Peoria, state capital of Springfield, the suburbs of St. Louis, in Madison County, and Champaign-Urbana, the home of the University of Illinois. In Mississippi, looks like Romney won a couple of rural counties, but when you look, they're actually the headquarters of Ole Miss and Mississippi State. So I'm looking to see whether or not that pattern of picking off university towns in seemingly rural areas continue. I'm also going to be looking on the exit polls. The swing voters in Republican primaries are people who call themselves somewhat conservative. Romney's been carrying those pretty handily. It's the reason why he's winning the nomination, is because he has the loyalty of those voters. The most recent PPP polls had him ahead by 60 to 20 over Santorum among that group. If that would be greater than he's won before. If he continues that margin, that's a good sign that he's beginning to consolidate the center around him. In Louisiana is divided into 3. They're divided into the Baptist rural north, the Catholic Acadian rural south, and the New Orleans and its suburbs. The one Louisiana poll so far has Romney running ahead in New Orleans and its suburbs, has Gingrich running well in the south, and Santorum running well in the Baptist north. That pretty much tracks what we've seen in the deep south, which is that in Baptist areas where Huckabee did well, Santorum is the favored candidate. In rural areas where McCain did well in 2008, Gingrich does much better, and Romney continues to do well in the cities. So now that Gingrich is fading, I want to see whether or not he holds his strength in the non-Baptist South, because if he doesn't, that would presumably move towards Santorum and would give Santorum a larger victory in Louisiana than I think he's going to get.
It just, our conventional wisdom has been that if Gingrich dropped out, it would benefit Santorum. I would take a contrarian point of view on this one. The critical issue here is when, if ever, does Mitt Romney get 1,144 delegates? And if he continues to lag in those numbers, then that's where the big problem for him emerges. Now, it's certainly the case if by the final contest on June 26, which happens conveniently to be Utah, he's within 50. There are enough superdelegates and uncommitted delegates that almost certainly he will get over that mark before the convention. But if he falls much short of that, he's got a headache on his hands. And with more candidates in the race, given the proportional nature of it, and if there are any pockets of support for Newt out there, he pulls in a few delegates. Those are not necessarily delegates that would have gone to Santorum. And given Santorum's weakness in getting delegate slates in many of these places, that could actually be of significant benefit to anybody but Romney.
Norm, let me point out that the polls support your view. We haven't had on the exit polls, and we've had 16 of the entrance and exit polls thus far. We haven't had a second choice question. Who would your second choice be? But both ABC News and Gallup have asked that. In the new Gallup poll, if Gingrich were to drop out, his votes would divide evenly between Romney and Santorum, and the ABC Post poll shows exactly the same thing. Michael.
A couple of addendum points. Henry mentioned university counties tending to go for Romney. There is one glaring exception. Athens County, Ohio, which is the site of Ohio University. It's in the hills of near the West Virginia border and the Ohio River in southeast Ohio.
They're in the Sweet 16.
What's that about? Anyway, so that county was actually Rick Santorum's best county in Ohio, and my theory is that the rather small faculty or university community there was a sort of let's go vote, mischievous let's go vote for Santorum move, mixing with the tendency of people in this rural, hilly, southern accented area that may live outside of the coffee shops of Athens. To vote for Santorum, combining to give him the best percentage in any of the 88 counties in Ohio. Norm, I haven't seen what you've seen on the minimum wage. I've apparently missed it, but I've heard Mitt Romney talk about indexing the minimum wage, which would tend to raise minimum wages as the indexed inflation would go up, and have heard him being criticized by some conservative voices like the Wall Street Journal, although not by other candidates. How did I miss this talk about abolish the minimum wage?
Well, you don't have these candidates formally saying it, but they basically have come close to implying it, which is just not what we've seen in these contests before.
I think that's a very minimal thing.
On the Gingrich question, PPP, when it does its polls, does ask a second. Every poll it's done asks the candidate question, then says, if Newt Gingrich were to drop out, who would you vote for? And each one of those polls, it shows Santorum gaining percentage on Romney. But it's not huge. The Illinois poll had Romney had 45 to 30. If Gingrich were out of the equation, that would be cut 45 to 34. North Carolina poll, they had Romney up by a couple of points over Santorum, with Gingrich on the ballot getting 24%. Gingrich drops out, Santorum goes ahead, but it's only by 3 or 4%. So it's not the boon, even on the best evidence, that the Santorum campaign thinks it is. The reason, jumping ahead what Norm was talking about with getting to the delegates, there's no way Romney can get to 1144 if Santorum stays in the race until California votes on June 6th. And I mentioned what I mentioned about sports teams, in part to drive home a point. But if you look at California, California is the state after New Jersey, which also votes on that day, that has the highest percentage of its population in a media market that's served by a major league sports team. It's got 33 million out of 38 million that's in a media market that's served by a major league sports team. And that is a state that, if you look congressional district by congressional district, because of the moderate nature or the high income nature of these voters, almost certainly Romney has 30 of the 53 congressional districts in the bag. Based on current demographic patterns, he probably has close to 40. At best, if Santorum were to start being able to appeal to ex-urbanites who aren't religious, which is a stretch at the way he's conducting his campaign now, he might be able to get 15 congressional districts out of it. This is going to be a huge win for Mitt Romney, even unless Santorum turns his campaign around. And New Jersey votes the same day. It's a winner-take-all state. Between those two states and Utah, which is also winner-take-all, Romney's basically got 250 delegate lead. He's basically got 250 to 300 delegates in the bag without any competition.
Yeah, I think it may even be better than that, because California, as I recall, is winner-take-all by congressional district. John McCain carried it last time by 7 or 8 points, and he carried 48 of the 53 congressional districts, with Mitt Romney carrying the other 5, and that's one of the reasons Mitt Romney dropped out immediately after Super Tuesday when California voted last time, because of McCain's huge delegate haul in there. So I think, if anything, Romney's more likely to carry 40 than 40
Yeah, I was
than
trying to
30
be favorable. I mean, when I
Yeah.
look at it, I actually see 6 to 8 districts I think Santorum will carry, and about 30 to 35 that Romney will definitely carry, and the rest are leaning Romney but swing. 45 to 8 means that's 135 delegates for Romney plus the 13 statewide, 150 delegates to 20. That just wipes out Santorum.
55 to 15 for me.
Yeah. Let's turn to President Obama. There's certainly a lot of evidence from the polls that he's reconstructing the coalition that elected him in 2008. I don't know how many of you have watched the Obama video, the documentary, but he's clearly trying to make this election a choice, not a referendum election. Thoughts on that strategy?
One thing, I'll confess to being an election geek, okay?
Figured that out. We figured that out.
So one of the things I do is I take these. If you go on computer, you can a lot of times people will ask you questions. Pick your favorite candidate. They won't tell you who the candidates are. You pick what the statements are, and then you find out who you should be voting for. It's always worked for me. Even when I take them overseas, I pick the right European political party. So I did one of these in the Alabama primary, and lo and behold, my preferred candidate was Barack Obama. And my second preferred candidate was John Huntsman. And the reason I mention that is because if the coalition that Obama's put together in 2008 relied on that moderate income to affluent suburban swing voter who tended to like John Huntsman to the extent that they abandoned Mitt Romney and voted for Obama. And I'm a rock-ribbed conservative, and the rhetoric that Obama is using, which is what they did on this thing, is basically take language from the candidates and just put them up there, shows that if those are your top 2 choices, Obama's doing a great job at modeling for you. What he's saying is going to be resonating with those voters, and that's the sort of thing that Mitt Romney is going to have to compete with. Do I think that Obama can put it together to the degree he gets 53%? No. He was riding an anti-Republican wave in bad economic times. He's not going to equal 53% if Mitt Romney's the nominee. But could he get to 48, 49, 50% and win? Yeah, and he's moving in the direction to suggest that's a lot more likely than it was 6 months ago.
Well, actually, Barack Obama in 2008 won a higher percentage of the popular vote than any Democratic nominee in history except Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. 53 is actually a number of Republican nominees have gotten in that vicinity. Relatively few Democrats have, and I think it's partly proof that it's simply hard to hold together a majority coalition, particularly one that tends to be disparate, as the Democratic Party's coalitions tend to be more disparate. The old 19th century coalition of Southern segregationists and Northern Catholics. It was sort of, they were backing segregation in the saloon. It worked fine as long as the two sides never got together, but when they had a national convention at plank about whether to condemn the Ku Klux Klan, it was defeated by 4 votes out of 2,000 cast. That 1924, by the way, that was not the 2008 Democratic National Convention. I watched the 17-minute video, and I thought it was sort of wintry, depressing, minor key. I mean, they're trying to make the point that America may not be standing tall today, but that's because when Obama started off, we were 6 feet under, or nearly 6 feet under. He had a hard time. Same atmosphere. I went back and looked at Jimmy Carter ads from the 1980 campaign. And the similar thing, the loneliness of the presidential office. These were 30 and 60-second spots, not 17 minutes. And the Obama one is more vivid than the Carter ones, but you've got Carter alone in the Oval Office. In the video, you have Obama seen in the Oval Office from the outside window at night. You've got night vision there. It's dark and gloomy America. That's the candidate of hope and change. I think there's a dissonance there. Obama's standing has declined among young voters. He still does better with young voters than he does with other age groups, but this doesn't look like something that gives him a 66-32 with big turnout in university towns and singles apartments areas as he got among young voters in 2008. And if you want to contrast in moods, check out the Morning in America ad of Reagan, 64, 84. Optimistic, sunny, it's springtime, it's light and bright, a different idea, different feel.
You know, the question for an incumbent president, the first thing you want to avoid, of course, is a contested nomination where you're having to take on your own base. That's always a death knell, and Obama's managed to avoid that. But he's obviously had a problem with his base. The base has not been enthusiastic. They haven't been enthusiastic in part because the policies that he's pursued have not turned them on. We have a health care plan that did not include a public option, unlike Paul Ryan's Medicare plan right now, for example. We had environmental policies from ozone on that have driven them into depression almost. We have Guantanamo and torture policies and all of that. The best thing he's got going for him now is that the Republican nomination process and the rhetoric that's being used and the issues that are being focused on are turning on his base. They're getting them to see a much greater contrast than we've had before. On that front, he's been helped very much by, say, Rush Limbaugh, who, of course, has gone into a buzzsaw. He's lost almost all of his sponsors. He's down to two now, Twinkies and Ding Dongs. Although he's hoping to bring back Crisco as a sponsor. But the more we see focus on some of those social issues where there is a very distinct divide between younger voters and older voters, the more you see a focus on immigration in a fashion that alarms Hispanic voters. And I'm not sure that Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, is necessarily going to be able to bring back Mexican Americans or Puerto Ricans or others. Neither am I sure that the triumphant feel of the Romney campaign with a big victory in Puerto Rico really means that they've turned the corner on Hispanic voters. They've turned the corner on affluent Republican voters in Puerto Rico. That may not make all that much a difference. We may see at least some uptick in enthusiasm. But it's very clear that the enthusiasm level for young voters and minorities, including African Americans, is simply not going to be at the level that it was in 2008. And 53%, unless you have a Republican nominee who goes even further off the rails or makes a whole series of additional gaffes, it's not going to be a replay of what we had then.
Norm, Paul Ryan's going to be here at 11:30 today. I'm sure you've looked at the details that have been released of his budget. What's your assessment of
Well, Paul Ryan is releasing a budget today. There's still, from what we know, we still have some gaps in terms of the details. But we know that Ryan's plan is going to include the same kind of sweeping tax reform that Romney and Santorum have proposed. What we don't know yet is we know it's going to mean going down to two personal income tax rates, 10% and 25%. Of course, a quite sharp drop from the current top rate of 10 points or more. We know that the corporate tax rate is going to drop to 25%. What we don't know is how you offset that in terms of creating revenue neutrality, or if you don't. The Romney plan, which his architect Glenn Hubbard says is revenue neutral, we have no details. But frankly, the only way you can do that, cut those rates and make it revenue neutral, is if you either eliminate or dramatically cut back on the big deductions. That means the health insurance deduction, the charitable deduction, the state and local tax deduction. And those are very, very tricky and explosive issues and would raise a lot of additional questions. At the same time, you've got very significant, it's not clear to me at this point which Medicare plan we're going to see in this Romney budget. Is it the Medicare plan from his budget last year, which basically does eliminate Medicare as we know it 10 years from now? it basically turns it into a voucher system with just private plans? Or is it the Ryan-Wyden plan, which preserves traditional Medicare as an option for older voters in health insurance exchanges? That's the public option I was referring to earlier. We also know that there will be very substantial cutbacks from where we are now in every area of discretionary spending, and cutbacks from the deal that was reached in the on the debt limit in the Budget Control Act of last year. And Democrats are already poised to try and draw a contrast that Ryan and Republicans want to cut food stamps, cut education, all to preserve and, in fact, extend tax breaks for the rich. All of that will be fodder for discussion here. And it's going to draw some very sharp lines of contrast. And it's a reminder, Carlin, that what's going on in Washington and on Capitol Hill, even if mostly it's gridlock and these things are not going to be enacted into law, spills over into a presidential campaign. And what happens in the presidential campaign, including, I think, the tax plan drafted for Romney, is also interacting with what's going on here in Washington. And it should be added that we're going to have a confrontation over spending bills before this election, especially if the House Republicans insist on numbers that fall significantly below the deal that was reached on the debt limit. And remember, the fiscal year ends September 30th, so we could be looking at a looming shutdown on October 1. Pretty good timing, wouldn't you say, with an election coming up 5 weeks later?
Yeah. I want to get your questions. We only have about 15 minutes left, but I'd like to ask one thing about the Ryan plan. The Ryan camp seems to believe that this budget is going to appeal to political independence because of its frankness and its honesty. Can they be successful there? Henry or Michael?
Well, I think, Paul Ryan is taking some political risk here. Norm has outlined the sort of rhetoric that we'll hear from the Democratic leaders. It sounds a little shop-worn to me. And, of course, you'd have the Democratic leadership in the Senate, not for the third year in a row, not proposing any budget at all. An act of political cowardice and policy irresponsibility. Senator Kent Conrad is retiring. He's been chairman or ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee for a long time. He came to Congress saying he was going to do something about the deficit. He hasn't even put forward a budget for 3 years running. Not a highly responsible record. In any case, I think Paul Ryan's taking a real political risk here, and the House Republicans have gone out on a limb with him. When I look at polling currently at the generic vote for the Congress, it's 44-44 in the RealClearPolitics.com average. Historically, that question has tended to under-predict Republican performance, but in 2010, it was pretty much spot on. So I think, that would tend to suggest that you get, if you have a tie in the popular vote with the way House districting is setting up, Republicans tend to win a majority of the seats. That's not because of a big gain in redistricting. I think my calculation and also Charlie Cook's, they only gained a net of 1 seat. It is a change of, it's the Voting Rights Act, which tends to cluster heavily Democratic areas in particular districts and leave the other districts more Republican. So it's a political risk. It doesn't seem to be deadly at this point.
Henry, how risky?
I think it's riskier for a presidential candidate to embrace that than it is for the House Republicans because of the collective nature. It's hard for people to identify a particular member with a collective institution. The risk for Republicans on entitlements, though, is very strong. Republicans, since the Great Depression, have tended to be viewed as the party that doesn't represent the aspirations of the average person. They come to power when the Democrats are viewed as even less in tune with the aspiration of the average person. What the Ryan budget presumes is that that fundamental equation can be changed, that people are ready for moving forward into a post-New Deal consensus. And the polling suggests that they may be ready in some respects, but that they're not ready to make the full leap. And a Republican that wants to talk about entitlements needs to talk as much about what they're keeping and what they're protecting as what they're changing. They need to speak about the value that Republicans place on the continued supports that that they would impose as on empowering people through choice. I think the future of Republicans' entitlements, that includes the Ryan budget, very much depends on how people perceive the motivations of the proposals. And if they perceive them as being primarily driven by money and the return of a sense that give the Republicans power and we'll go back to the period before the New Deal, then I think that the Ryan budget and more specifically the entitlement reforms that Republicans have coalesced around are likely not to be accepted. But if people can understand not just that this is a measure that's meant to save money, but it's something that's actually going to benefit them in the long run, then I think there's a fighting chance, particularly if there's a president who can embrace it and articulate that message.
Let me add, I agree with Henry. I think Mitt Romney will be hard-pressed not to support the Ryan budget. He supported last year's Ryan budget. What Ryan is going to do is turn this budget into a reconciliation bill, a big reconciliation bill, and that will mean that all of the additional committees will be directed to make spending cuts that fit these numbers. Where this creates a dilemma, I think, is it's much easier to talk about how you're going to basically offset tax cuts with vague notions of cutting spending, either 10% across the board or cutting out waste, fraud, and abuse. This now will force committees to operationalize very serious changes in discretionary domestic spending, and they're leaving defense aside almost entirely, which puts even more pressure on that part of the budget. And so when you're starting to get into the heat of the campaign, we're going to be seeing commitments made to very specific spending cuts that a lot of people are not going to see as waste, fraud, and abuse.
Let's turn to your questions now. Gary, first.
Thanks. Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. I want to ask a two-part question because there's a chance there's a connection and a chance there's not, and that's what I want to get at in the question. The two parts are America elects, and I'm particularly interested in getting your perspective on whether you think they will be an effective, have the capacity to be an effective factor in this election. And the second part of the question has to do with depending upon what you think and what you know about America elects, particularly the logistics of when they go to market, if you will, and when we're going to know who their ticket is, whether that heightens the likelihood that Tampa will see either a contested or a brokered election.
Henry.
Two observations. One, I think the sort of candidate that America elects is likely to want, given the background of their people, since they're not going to put Ron Paul on their ticket despite the internet voting, is the sort of person who's going to appeal to that suburbanite, affluent person. I think rather than ask about the logistics, the key question is the candidate somebody who is viewed as somebody who is serious? If it's somebody who, like the Reform Party in 1996, where the best they could do to put on Ross Perot's ticket was find Ed Schau, then I don't think they'll be viewed as seriously. But if they can find somebody who is, put together a bipartisan ticket like Olympia Snowe and Joe Lieberman, who have credibility on their own, who could raise money on their own, then they can't win, but they could provide a place for people dissatisfied with both major parties to cast a vote and consequently be decisive. But the second question, Tampa, I don't think that that's going to really affect Tampa at all. I think right now, the way things are going, Mitt Romney just needs to be patient, and he's going to be the nominee. There's virtually no way that Santorum and Gingrich combined can do more than keep him from getting very close to the magic 1144. And I don't think the superdelegates are going to go through a brokered convention. I think they'll fall into line at that point.
The last report, I think, suggested that Americans Elect is already on the ballot in 12 states and poised to be on the ballot in 18 more very soon. So,
I think for a third-party candidate to be effective, it has to be somebody who is something of a celebrity. a name that is known, a position that's known. I think that's not going to happen because Donald Trump endorsed Romney, and you've heard Ann Romney on election night thanking Donald Trump. They've been using him on robocalls, so they want to keep Donald Trump happy, obviously. Brokered convention. People always say, can't we have a convention like the wonderful 1924 convention that went 103 ballots? The reason you had those conventions working that way in those days was that they were actually a medium of communications. People did not, men of business, there weren't very many women of business, did not talk to each other on long-distance telephone as a routine matter. They did not travel to jet airports and meet at the Admirals Club or the Delta Sky Room with people at DFW or O'Hare and run into each other all the time. The convention city was the only place where you could really make a deal. There were no delegate counts by media organizations until Martin Plissner of CBS did one in 1968. To get that, why would you wait to the convention to negotiate your majority if when we've got now means of communication that do what the convention did in the past? Deals will be made beforehand. To get the old convention, you would have to abolish long-distance telephones, suspend the internet, and probably get rid of air conditioning to make the picture complete. So. We're not going to be waiting for what Pennsylvania is going to do on the third ballot.
Norm, very quickly, and I
yeah.
want to get a couple of more
Okay.
questions before we have to conclude.
One, Americans will likely be on the ballot in all 50 states, and that does make them a force of sorts. We know that people like Christy Todd Whitman and David Boren have indicated some interest in this process. And we know there are others who are not household names, but who at least could provide some credibility on the issues front. It's hard for me to imagine this process working out in a way where they have a credible nominee who could capture a lot of support. But independent candidates can muck up presidential contests in a fairly big way. And just a quick comment on the Republican process. The more it's drawn out, Mitt Romney does have to remain patient. I think the problem is the longer this goes on, the more there are opportunities for him to improvise. And every time he improvises, he shoots himself in some part of his anatomy. So that is the one thing that perhaps could keep him from getting close to that elusive 1144.
All right, let's get a couple of questions here, and there, and then each of us can choose which one to answer.
Thanks, Carlin. Erwin Stelza, Hudson Institute. Norm, you have me a little confused on your comments on the budget on 2 points. One is that in your two separate answers, you've listed as essentially uncuttable almost every item in the budget. You've got a sort of horror story of things that would have to be done, like state tax deductions and all of that. Is it possible that if you factor in some growth advantages to the lower tax rates that are being discussed, plus elimination of, let's call them loopholes, and I don't mean things like even the mortgage deduction, which I would love to see go, but is it possible that you then get numbers that work without attacking the most popular of all of the deductions?
Yeah, on June 5th, there's going to be the recall election for Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin. I was wondering if you guys thought, if any of you thought that impact, assuming Walker was either thrown out or if he manages to survive, would have any sort of impact on the race and how particularly the Republicans would look at size of government issues.
Hi, Jasper Steinmetz from TV2 Denmark. 2 quick questions. What does Romney need to do to gain sympathy among rural voters, and who's going to be his vice presidential pick?
Why don't you start, and then Norm, you can answer Erwin's question, and Michael, you can answer the question about Scott Walker.
Rural voters.
Very quickly.
A few things. He needs to personalize himself. Rural voters, like humans who are
Damn.
Who they can emphasize with. He should do a few things. One, campaign with his wife together. She humanizes him. Bring them out as a couple.
How about
Two,
a dog? Maybe that would help.
Two, slow down. Mitt Romney talks a mile a minute. He sounds and looks like a prototypical city slicker. If he wants to appeal to rural and small town voters, take a cue from Ronald Reagan. Slow down your speech. Tell some stories. He's a data anecdote a minute, but if the most successful candidates with white working class and rural voters are people like Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan, who can put their facts together in a narrative and a story that people immediately grasp. And the final thing is understand sports. If there's one thing that men, particularly in rural areas, empathize with, it's sports heroes and sports athletics. When he called in on the night of the Alabama primary to the leading sports talk show in Birmingham, which was a good play. Unfortunately, when asked about where Peyton Manning should sign, he talked about the owners of the Patriots and the Jets that he knew. Maybe he should talk about Peyton's neck, is his neck, the vertebrae surgery. Maybe he should actually talk a little bit about sports. Obama's very good about that. He's shown at White Sox games, people know he's a Bulls fan. He does the NCAA brackets. That shows, that's all shows, hey, he's a bit of a regular guy. If he wants to appeal to these voters, Mitt Romney needs to show he's a bit of a regular guy.
Erwin, I hate to leave you confused, but the first is almost all of these cuts that we're talking about are in the 1/8 of the budget that is discretionary domestic spending, which has already been whacked at several times. And most of those programs, there are always places that you can cut, but we're talking about moving into areas where most voters would not see as waste, fraud, and abuse. On the tax front, you can always develop a dynamic scoring model that somehow shows magically that you could cut your tax rates down to 1% and you get this boom in economic growth that gives you the goose that laid the golden egg. I have not seen evidence that cutting rates that much is going to bring in more revenues. And most of the money comes from the big deductions. You can cut out some loopholes, but you're not going to raise enough money if you're cutting the tax rates at this level. Also, keep in mind that every model from the Tax Policy Center and almost every other organization shows that this change in the tax code provides an enormous additional benefit to Mitt Romney and his class of the most affluent voters, and very little benefit to those in the bottom 20%. So you've got a bit of a political problem on that front as well. You can mask it up a little bit. You can do it when you're Mitt Romney and come up with a budget and say details to be filled in later. It's a little bit tougher for Paul Ryan, and I'll be interested to see how he manages to do it.
Michael Scott Walker, and
Scott
also
Walker.
the big government, small government.
Okay, well, just a footnote to Norm. My understanding, Republicans on the super committee did agree to limit those big deductions for high earners in a way that they would still produce a lot of revenue, but their rates would be cut. So there's some willingness on the part of Republicans to make a move in that direction. We'll see whether or not Paul Ryan talks about that later this morning. Scott Walker. This is something we haven't talked about, but is important in a really macro way, which is state and local government spending, which is a significant part of total government spending, and the place of public employee unions. I think this is really Armageddon for the move to tamp down the powers of the public employee unions. Basically, they have constructed in many states and localities a tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect machine, in which you basically have public financing of the Democratic Party through public employee unions getting their dues checked off and sent automatically, taxpayer money sent to the union, sent to the Democratic Party. And Scott Walker has been trying to put a stop to this. It's saved a lot of money. He's seems to be ahead a little in the polls. You've also got to move to recall more Democratic incumbents or Republican incumbent state senators there. If the unions win this, I think that the drain on the private sector by the public employee unions will continue in states like California, New York, New Jersey, and so forth. There will be no stopping it. If Walker wins, there's the possibility of movements like his in other states, although in Ohio, the Republicans under Governor John Kasich lost their referendum. They did not frame the issue in an attractive enough way. So this is an important part of the American political scene, and it has national implications. AFSCME, the major public employee union, headquartered a block away from here, spent, I think, $95 million on Democratic candidates. That's taxpayer financing of the Democratic Party in a significant amount.
Well, thank you all for coming, and to the question about who will be the vice president, we'll answer that at the next Election Watch. So thank you very much for coming, and thank my